right. Hello, welcome everyone. So this session, we are looking at the last chapter for the book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And in this chapter, David Graeber tries to set up a way of understanding where we might be headed. Because of course, he starts the book by pointing out the path of history over 5,000 years shows variations between credit regimes and regimes that are on bullion. And as history goes through credit regimes and bullion regimes, that bullion regimes are associated with violence, enslavement, military complexes, and that credit regimes allow for greater human expression of freedom because they are, at least historically, according to Graeber, they rely less on the enslavement of the peoples themselves. And so under bullion regimes, there is a tendency for colonial conquest, rooted in a material understanding of value, whereas under credit regimes, there are promises that really are more emblematic of what's at stake when we talk about credit arrangements, which is credit arrangements are merely promises that allow us to kind of try to keep our promises. And that money, on the other hand, comes about when there's a confluence of math and violence and a kind of absolute object to what constitutes human value. So the difference between a bullion regime is there is ultimately an absolute value that's kind of embodied in a material, whereas in a credit regime, there's the possibility of debts being erased because they are not beholden to some military industrial complex that is there to serve as the sovereign basis of value. So that's where he ends by saying in 1971, Richard Nixon took the United States, the dollar, which by that point was the global currency because any country that wanted to purchase oil, which is necessary for most of modern infrastructure, certainly in the post-World War II period, before the advent of solar, that oil is necessary in order to run the industrial economy that we know to be in place. So we can think of the dollar as really a universal currency. So in 1971, when Richard Nixon went off the gold standard, he, in essence, took the United States and the entire world, for that matter, off of a bullion standard and placed it in this imaginary credit realm. And so what Graeber argues is that 1971 represents something of a watershed moment because it represents the moment where, should the United States ever want to declare a debt jubilee, we are in an actual position where we can, the United States government can, keeping in mind this very important quote that David has on page 364 of this chapter, at least in the version that I have. And that is, he's talking about how credit money is quite literally a government that can print as much money as it wants to. So he's setting up his argument that the United States has become a credit regime that can implement debt jubilee by canceling debt. And yet he then on page 364 mentions that there is one reason why the Federal Reserve can't just print money indiscriminately. And that is because because it's not the US government that prints money. It's the Federal Reserve, which is a private consortium of banks. So this is a really important point, because what he's saying, and here's the quote that I love, there's a reason why the wizard has such a strange capacity to create money out of nothing. Behind him, there's a man with a gun. So money is printed out of nothing, yet in the United States, it's not the government that prints money, it's the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve is owned by a bunch of private bankers. So Graeber's kind of presenting a contradiction here, because on the one hand, he's saying under credit regimes, we can wipe debt away, and yet he's at the same time saying, well, but the only reason why we can print money is because there's someone behind that money with a gun. So to me, there's a contradiction there. And what the contradiction is governments can abolish debt, but in order for the Federal Reserve to abolish debt, they would first need to abolish the men with the guns. And this brings me to another very important talk that David Graeber gave, I think in 2014, where he says, he makes the argument that man with the gun, there are indeed men with guns out there, and those are police officers. Police officers are simply bureaucrats with guns. But if you take away their guns and you think about society having a gun, because the conventional argument is if you erase all debt and you issue a debt jubilee, that there will be just crazy chaos and that people will run wild in the streets. And what Graeber elsewhere has argued is that belief in social chaos is a myth, because this social gun that we think is pointed at us, should we ever like declare freedom, that gun has no trigger. It's just a machine. It's the appearance of the machinery of violence. Yes, there is violence, and yes, there are bureaucrats with guns. But what he argues, the connection that he makes in Dawn of Everything to kind of complete the circle, is he says that all of those bureaucrats with guns, that in those times of millennial revolutionary transformation, that when given orders to turn the guns against the population, that the majority of people just decide simply to go home. And so that great big social chaos that supposedly will happen if we don't have a police force is a myth, is what he's arguing. So I'm going to open it up there. The quote that I'm, sort of left with here is that, yes, there are bureaucrats with guns who value their money, but there aren't so many of them that we don't have them outnumbered. And so we always historically have the bureaucrats with guns outnumbered. If you extrapolate that to the larger kind of idea of nuclear weaponry, what the two Davids in Dawn of Everything say is that in those moments where an order has been given to drop the bomb, the number of people that it takes in order to drop that bomb, there might be a bomb dropped, but that what history shows is that historically people will not show up, and that's when they abandon the very project. So I promised to start with Paul. So let me. What was? Did I get the name wrong? I apologize.
With Zach.
It was Zach. I'm sorry, not Paul. So Zach, please, if you wanted to start.
Oh, hi. Hi, Stephen. Actually, when I raised my hand before the recording, it was actually kind of a follow-up question to what you were talking about before the discussion about how you appreciated debt as a grand narrative, and we don't do grand narratives anymore. And it was sort of a follow-up question to that, or like, what is exactly the thing that is suppressing these types of works from, being written in academia. And so I don't know if that's something I don't think that's a great springboard for continuing the discussion. So I'd love to ask the question, but maybe later.
Okay, yeah, I think that's fair. We might circle back to that. I certainly have kind of a concise answer that has to do with the immediate imperatives of publishing versus perishing, and if one has a particular academic expertise, the goal, at least on the tenure clock, is to squeeze as many articles out of that one research project as possible. And so by design, it works against thinking expansively and instead thinking much more pragmatically about how can I take this one argument and grind out like 14 different articles from it. So I went ahead and kind of gave an answer now.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Anyone else want to chime in with some thoughts?
I had a question about the idea that the soldiers will put down their guns, and that is with the importation of foreign soldiers as a technique now.
Yeah, and I think Putin and the Wagner Group is a good example of that. So what I think, here's how given what I know about history and about the kind of argument that Graeber's making, what we typically find historically is under bullion regimes, there's an effort to use enslaved peoples. And so enslaved peoples are captured and then they're turned as prisoners of war into soldiers to go capture more enslaved peoples. Whereas under a credit regime, the attempt is to do it with an internal force, because the internal force can be extended promises that work in the internal side of things rather than the expansive side. I'm not being very clear in my explanation here. Under credit regimes, Graeber argues that the tendency is for less violence because the extension of credit is an extension of a promise. And that extension of a promise means that should someone not pay someone back, that the penalty is easier to absolve or to write down. Whereas in bullion, there are still credit arrangements, but ultimately, because bullion is a measurable, weighable thing like a chunk of gold, if someone doesn't produce X amount of chunk of gold, then they will be killed. Whereas under a credit regime, the historical tendency is less so, because the confluence of math and violence in the absence of a material bullion thing is less absolute. Whereas under a credit regime, there's still a value, it's a number. So you owe someone X amount of current money, but it's less absolute because it's more imaginary, whereas a piece of gold is ultimately something that's tangible and material. I think that's how I would explain that. Christian.
Yeah, thank you. Just maybe also wanting to reply to the question of the soldiers from abroad, so to speak. I mean, this was like a trend in history. You know, you had the Janissaries in the Ottoman Empire, which were basically orphans that became soldiers. And then the Ottoman Empire at some point became to break down when they decided they just didn't want to be soldiers only anymore. They wanted to participate in the state, have positions of power. Before that, they were supposed to be kind of like warrior monks without families. And, you know, their only attachment would be to the state. which funnily enough leads me then over to the Prussian bureaucracy, because the bureaucrats that were running Prussia, you know, they also were attached mainly to the state. So they had a completely different outlook. And then in our times, we got rid of the bureaucrats, right? At least here in my lifetime. I'm originally German. I remember when I was a kid in the 70s and in the 80s, there was a huge number of bureaucrats, and now there's nearly none left. You know, that system was basically abolished in neoliberal times, so to speak, because they said like, oh no, we don't want these people that are loyal to the state. You know, we want people that are loyal to the market, so to speak. You know, and if you have a guaranteed pension, you can't be fired. You know, you just don't care because you're not afraid, right? And also talking about like your example with Putin and the Wagner Group. I mean, this is probably right. I don't really know about the composition of this entity, but I think we have to give first dibs more to the United States post 9/11 with Blackwater as the most famous example. And I mean, the perfidy is even greater when you think about the American police force, because they quite often police communities that they themselves don't live in. I mean, this is part of what you do. You send the cops to the different neighborhood, right? Yeah. And so I think that, you know, when right now in the war in Ukraine, this is very strongly termed as a conflict of values, but the values are the same on the Russian side as on the American side. You know, deep down, you know, obviously, you know, the West cares about human rights and and Putin, you know, doesn't. Yeah, but if you just look at what happens every day, you know, this argument becomes kind of hard to sustain. And maybe one more addendum to the debt jubilee thing about the national debt. If I bend it back to your original intro, what another thing is that you have to keep in mind. I completely agree with that. The social chaos might be imaginary. That there is like this book by Rebecca Solnit, A Paradise Built in Hell, where she basically goes into the Katrina catastrophe in New Orleans and says, look, these guys were organizing for themselves until the feds started to show up, and then it got worse. Yeah. And also what's important here is like, if you had a debt jubilee, I think this is where you get the middle class really scared. Because if you were to forgive the debt, you'd wipe out half national savings in the US. You know, and that's people's 401ks, that's their future. And I think last time when we talked about this is like the fear at the center of capitalism that keeps things together, because you don't have anybody to rely on, because you don't have a network of social trust that you know will take care of you when you grow sick, when you get sick or something like this. What you have, the only thing is what you have is in your bank account, right? That's the only thing that counts. And you always have to make sure there's more. So you're constantly afraid that you're going to lose that. And it becomes, the perfidy again increases once you get incentivized not only to have money in the bank account. No, your money is in your 401k that is invested in the stock market. You know, that makes you complicit. And I'm nearly done. Final thing, just bending it even back further to the original statement. And I think this is going back to, I think, what was at the heart of much of David Graeber's writing. It was to open up the imagination. Like, we cannot imagine something else anymore. I think he says so here in the last chapter. He says we should try to get back to the point where we can imagine to be actors in history with influence on how this is going to go down. And I think the last time we had this, you know, not necessarily in the way people wanted it. I mean, that's Marx, right? When he said like, okay, you know, there's this force and people are in history here, and then, you know, communist regimes showed up. And I have a good friend here who is very on the left side of politics, who was active in unions and was at the head of the local left-wing party even. And I've had discussions with him, and then we talk when we talk about, you know, what leftism, if we want to call it that, used to be 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. He says, yeah, well, you know, all these ideas, that was kind of great, but it led to some of the greatest crimes in history. And it's like people on the left are conditioned to only look at the bad stuff. Not saying we should emulate Stalin. That's not what I'm saying, okay? I'm just saying it's like we're so conditioned not to look at the possibility that is buried in these words anymore. We're only supposed to look at the worst outcomes, not at the good ones, you know, just the bad ones. And that's all there is. And again, this is this opening up of history and saying, you know, we can be actors in this. Yeah, so I'm done.
Steven, would you like to talk?
Sure. I'm not sure that I can. I'm not going to take as grand a scope as Christian's comments, but there's a lot that I'd love to talk about within Christian's comments. But first, or what I'd like to focus on first, is the distinction. And let me be clear. There's a lot that I really like in what Christian said. So thank you for all those comments. I'd like to go back to the distinction, though, between Boolean systems and credit systems and what Nixon actually did. As David Graeber points out, it's not that we've gone to a more stable system. In fact, violence has gotten worse. Authoritarianism has gotten worse. Where it's almost as if we're operating in a hyper Boolean system. And I'm wondering if the issues, and I've watched the videos of the last two group conversations that I missed. I'm wondering if the issues is the decontextualization of the economic mechanisms. So in the early part of the book, the economic tools are very contextualized. They are loose exchange systems. There are promises to each other. They're not even strong promises. It's their relationships. It's highly contextualized. Even within a credit system, especially in the early credit systems, it's highly contextualized. If a tavern issues a IOU or a credit system, you have to trust it. You have to know it. You can't sign it over to somebody who's a complete stranger. It's very contextualized. You know who to go to if the promise is not repaid. With Boolean, you decontextualize that. In the same way that corporations decontextualize human morality, right? So corporations can act without morality because they've become an abstraction of what a human is. Boolean can act in or create immoral actions or sustain immoral actions because they're somehow decontextualized from a human economy. And what happened with being able to float the value of currency, of paper currency, doesn't seem to me to be going back to the credit system as it's understood early on, which is a highly or more contextualized system. In fact, it's an even less contextualized system. It's an abstraction of Boolean. It's a further abstraction. And so it's not that we've gone to where we're suddenly in a credit system again. We're in a system that is kind of using the credit model to mimic the Boolean system. And I'll leave it there and come back to other themes later on.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because if you think about, so, he mentions how it was only 13 years prior to 1971 when the American Express card was invented, and he uses that as kind of like, as the start of the credit card industry. And if you think of what at least in this country, the United States, what the credit card industry has done is it's made an alliance using lobbyists and bribes. It's made an alliance with the government to allow for interest rates that historically were considered usurious and are now, now that there's no longer any limit. I think credit rates, that's where the free floating of the dollar is, the free floating of the interest rate. And so you're absolutely right that we're not really in a virtual regime. We're in what, in Dawn of Everything, he says is that combination of charismatic politics, bureaucracies, credit bureaucracies, and then sovereignty bureaucracies, which are monopolies of violence, and that you've got all three in the form of the U.S. government. And so though we should be living in a virtual credit complex, it's actually it's a fascist regime. That's a really good point. Thank you. Anyone else want to? Michael.
You just throw in the original reason why you consider a credit system, or like the idea that money exists before you have cash, before you have coinage, is that people traded and they kind of knew who owed each other something, but it's a human relationship. It's maybe on a small scale, and it doesn't exceed the kind of social relations that you need every day. Yeah, I could grab all my money from that person and shake them down because they owe me, but I live in this village, I work with these people, and in the long term, it's better to kind of work this out in a different way. And sometimes it was just better to just drop it, right? And drop that money. So when you get coinage, and so there's a temporality that exists. If you've got a credit, you've got to know the person long enough for them to pay you back. And in the coinage, the money goes quick, and it's like, here's your money, and you leave, right? And you don't have to ever see that person again. So that temporal relationship, I think, is kind of important in this. And maybe it looks like the credit system today, because cash today, even though Richard Nixon dropped the gold standard, one would say gold was only at some level, an agreement to pay something. Like, does it have inherent value? Like, he has that remark, if it's a fiat currency, well then, that assumes that gold really was real money. I mean, it's like anything, something is an agreement to pay. There's nothing that has inherent value. The value is the relationship or the world that you build when you exchange something. And at some point, that's kind of some of the things I'm thinking of. When Richard Nixon drops the gold standard, I've still got cash around that I can get from a bank, or I've got a credit card, which is a very acute money system, and it's not interpersonal. Even though it's a tab on a thing, they've got computers that will hold this all together. So it's very much like the wealthy people have, and the bankers have built a system where, okay, the currency is gone, the gold standard is gone at the global level, but for individuals, it's there. So the issue is, okay, well, if this credit regime, where you have interpersonal credit, extend between countries, things like that, but it's not necessarily saying, oh, you personally can be forgiven your debt because you operate in a social relationship. So this, just as like the axial age and the, sort of the age of capitalist empires were similar, but they had quite a lot different that had been brought in and learned from previous times. It seems like, this new age of no gold standard is also quite different and has dragged a lot of things in. It quite begs the question of, it makes a nice theoretical setup to say, here's gold and credit, bullion and credit. How many of us believe that the dropping of the bullion standard right now sets us personally free or returns us to a new Middle Ages? So I think there's lots more to be looked at here about what will happen in the future.
Peter, and then Nika. I think you're on mute, Peter.
That's better, maybe. I think it was Steven said something about the dollar floating free from the gold standard really just created a different virtual gold standard that still functioned the same, and it's all still controlled by the same group. I spent a long time thinking about David's story about the gold under the Federal Reserve, the vaults underneath. And it really struck me that it doesn't matter whether the gold is there or not at all. It never has. I wondered if any of you knew anything about Keynes's system that he came up with after World War II called the Bancor, which was for international finance between countries, where the debtors and I have no real good understanding of it, but my understanding was that the debtors and the creditors were free to just make their own arrangements as long as it kept within a certain percentage of the overall value, and that if it went outside of that, it was the mutual responsibility of both the creditor and the debtor to figure out how to get it back. And that seemed like a pretty interesting idea. I wondered if anybody knew more detail about that.
I don't have more detail that I can add, but I can recommend a book that came out within the last, I think, 2 years. It's by an economist. He is one of the few non-classical economists left in the econ department at Harvard. His name is Steven Marglin. Actually, let me put it in the text, in the chat. And he's written a book called Raising Keynes that I've only started reading the book. I'm familiar with Marglin's work. He's been an economist since the early 1960s, who was trained in the classical model, but during the Vietnam War had a radicalization and has been a sort of a very active radical political economist since then. He wrote an incredibly influential piece called "What Do Bosses Do?" that appeared in the Review of Political Economy back in 1974. David Graeber has cited it quite a bit. So anyway, what Marglin argues is that Keynes did work out this system, and that the system does have a kind of a beautiful elegance to it, but that the kind of calculus, the math that was necessary in order to carry out some of his programs didn't exist at the time. And so what Marglin argues is that today the kinds of very particular economic policies that have to do with macroeconomic, monetary policies, that Keynes was kind of, that he didn't have the data sets and the power of computation and regressions available to him. And my math skills aren't strong enough to really kind of work through Marglin's piece yet, but based on the reviews that I've read, that's what Marglin argues, is that Keynes's model does hold weight, but that at the time people didn't have the mathematical skills to reason through what the implications of his findings were. So it's a fairly lengthy book. It's only available in hardcover, but it might have some answers. Nika, I know you had your hand up. Sorry.
Yeah, so I maybe off track. We're kind of everybody preparing their own question. So what is interesting for me, what I'm thinking about, is David is writing this article, the last chapter about kind of with the question, what happens next? And what we see now is exactly, this nexus unfolding in front of us. Like every day, the new country is saying that they actually, they are going to trade oil in a local currency. This is totally unimaginable. It's also in the same chapter as David is writing that we know what happens with Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi, who tried to do that, yeah. And now Saudi Arabia, who's a backbone of the petrodollar, is happily united with Iran and China and Brazil, and they all, like, this is just basically a coup. And it's, I don't read a lot in the mainstream American news about that. It's just kind of taken as given. So am I right that we are watching the collapse of the empire, like right now? And this is the major things that are going on? Because again, in this chapter, David described how United States is imposing colonial tax on everyone because of the petrodollar, and all these debts of United States doesn't mean anything because America is not going to give back the money, because of this 800 military base that they're financing, taking money from the others. So my question is, maybe some other people would be willing to share their opinion. What's going to happen if nobody will give money anymore? So what happens with this 800 military bases? Because I don't think these guys going to go home. I know how it was in Soviet Union. In Soviet Union, the Soviet army actually went home, and they did it because they believed that, they believed in the American dreams. They were thinking, okay, we're going to get home and then we will abandon socialism and we will live happily ever after in capitalism. They actually really believe in Fukuyama. That's why, for example, Soviet military that was very comfortably hosted in Germany, including Vladimir Putin, they went home and they were there in shit because Gorbachev didn't negotiate any reparation that he was able to do, of course, because in the moment he signed all his papers, the Soviet Union still was the world power. He just also believed that if we just, convert our military factories in do this conversion process, start to produce useful goods, then everybody will live good. We spend so much money and energy producing weapons. So what if we start to produce like vacuum cleaners and, useful stuff? Then of course it will be plenty for everybody. So it didn't happen. So my question is, what you guys think is going to happen now? Because it's really quick. It's a really big changes. It's really interesting. At the end of our reading group, we're exactly on the 12th chapter. We are watching that now in the news. And the last things, I also want to ask Michael about that, because we just had an event that Michael was one of the organizers about Lucas Plan, and about UK version of how workers try to convert the military plant in the UK to make its, human and serve human needs, but it didn't work out well as well. So on that pessimistic note, I will really appreciate if you share your opinion.
So just an opinion on, say exactly what? Just to talk about the Lucas plan, I can say briefly what it was.
No, I'm just, so my question is, summarize. So, like, looks like from 1972, how many years is that? 30, 50 years, yeah? So we are in the new epoch that is happening like this last 2 weeks. What gonna happen? What do you think gonna happen in the world if most of the population will stop using US dollars as the currency, like as a dominant currency? How would it affect our lives? And we are living in the different countries. More or less everyone here is from global West, not from global South. So we are talking about global West.
Well, certainly, I mean, the people, the ability of someone to use violence is the ability to kind of either hold a structure in place, whether it's a credit structure or not, or to demand their types. I mean, that was, whereas people say, oh, the Middle Ages, the gold standard broke down, it was much better. I mean, it was still a quite hierarchical society in many ways. It just didn't have an endless militarism that was funded by bankers that could go on a roll. And so I wonder, is that what we're talking about? Is there a collapse in an endless militarism? Certainly, the Lucas aerospace workers in the 1970s were like saying, we don't want to lose our jobs because of this economic system that they're rationalizing. Plus, they were making military weapons. So they said, let's make socially useful production. The things that we make should care about people. And so many people have argued that the opposition to militarism as a quite universal kind of way of opposing the use of violence, either between countries or even within communities.
I don't know who would like to go next. If Peter, Christian, I didn't see who put a hand up. Peter,
Go for
how
it,
about
Christian.
you?
Do you want to go first, or?
Yeah, how about
Go.
you, Peter?
Okay, well, I was just responding to Nico a little bit. The standard story in the United States is always to grow the economic pie, whether it's whenever anybody talks about inequality or trying to make life for regular folks better, it's always, well, if we just produce more stuff for the landfill, everybody will have jobs and we'll all be better off. And so I was thinking about David's book about bullshit jobs, because lots and lots of jobs in the United States, at least, are totally bullshit. Mine in particular, I have knowledge of. But the fact that ecologically it's not sustainable to keep growing the pie. I mean, the fundamental flaws of capitalism being tied to infinite growth, it's just not going to work out. And so it seems to me that we need, it's not just a matter of defeating militarism, it's a matter of defeating the whole mindset of modern life. I mean, if we don't reduce our consumption, we're not going to have a planet to live on. And that's the heavy lift, because there's nobody that I know of or am aware of in public life that's even willing to say that stuff yet.
Christian?
Yeah. I mean, there's so much basically to say now. We could probably have another session just on the questions which just all raised. But first of all, one thing I wanted to say is I think one thing that unites probably most people, if not everybody who's joined these sessions, is a desire for change. And I think one useful thing we should do is look at the attractiveness of the other side. And I'm just going to put this in the notes. And I've like last year, I read a book. It was called Capital: The Eruption of Delhi by Rana Dasgupta. And he's talking about, you know, the change in India since the 90s, basically. And one example is like where it becomes extremely attractive to not have, you know, a social economy, not be bound up in the, you know, the caste system of India, you know, especially if you take it from a feminist point of view. And because a lot of young women in India are very pro neoliberalism because they can get out of the house. They can have a career, they can have independent lives. And this is just something I want to say. I put this in the notes. I'm just saying, I think it's important. If you really want to have change, you have to realize the attractiveness of the other side. You got to know what the devil is offering and why it's tempting. That'd be number one. And the second one is like, I've been thinking about the closeness of math and war. And like I've mentioned before, I've been in IT, so the fringes of IT for a long time. And please don't get me wrong, but IT in the coding side, especially many of the better coders are neurodivergent. And they're extremely good at math, and they're really bad at human relationships. And then you build systems that are basically pure math in order to handle the world, you know, which you can see also with all the AI hype that's going on now. And there's a combination here, because math makes the world simple. So does violence. You can just cut through all the social bullshit, so to speak. Yeah, I know your cousin is married to my third-degree aunt and blah, 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 and we shouldn't do this because some time ago you gave me a cow or whatever. There's a moment where this simpleness is attractive, which also adds to, you know, understanding the other side. I think this is really important. And then maybe finally going into what Nika said. I mean, I've also been watching this. Actually, I've had like a lot of discussions with people recently, you know, people who are, so, I mean, this sounds derogatory. Well, it probably is. Office drones I have talked to lately at some stuff on my job. And, you know, everybody's talking about that, you know, it's like, oh, this is really, and I really wonder about that, because I think subconsciously, a lot of people want to see the US go. I mean, everybody here, I know most people are American, don't get me wrong, but if you're not American and you're a little conscious of what's going on, I mean, you're really tired of it. So I remember when I was a kid, okay? So my father in Germany in the 60s, he grew up next to an American air base in the countryside of Germany. And he was so positive about the US and the stuff. You know, he had friends on the base. You know, he could go there to do weightlifting, which wasn't possible anywhere else. I still have a jacket he got from a friend of his who then went to Vietnam and died. And if you looked at what America was so good at the time, was the soft power side, because the music was great, the movies were great, right? I mean, Stalin was screening American movies in the Kremlin at night, you know, because he loved them so much. And a lot of that has gone away. Also, if you look at like when the US joined the world economy prior to World War I, it was 50 or 60% of the world economy, you know, that just you know, you had the world economy without the US, so to speak, and then all of a sudden the US joins and it goes boom, you know, this enormous amount of power that, you know, built up basically in this unrecognized backwater, while, you know, people in Europe were focusing on and whose cousin was American, whose cousin, you know. And what we've seen since then is the decline in American power. If you look at the how big a part of, you know, world GDP America is today, finance and all that. I mean, it's still the most powerful country, and this kind of gets me to the question. I mean, on the one hand, not everybody, a lot of people want to see it go. On the other hand, don't underestimate the empire. You know, because of all the bumbling stuff you see in the media, there are some very smart and ruthless people running it. And they've pulled this out of the dirt more, out of the ditch more than once, you know. I mean, this could, you know, I mean, Lula could be gone tomorrow. If the US wanted Lula gone, he would be gone. I'm very sure of that. You know, India, China, that's a different story. Russia, obviously, so also. What going back to like when you look at what happened to the Soviet Union, I recently saw this on a blog post by an economist who said like, you know, the current head of the CCP in China, Xi Jinping, I think when he was, before he became to power, when he was a relatively young guy, maybe in his 30s or whatever, he wrote a piece on ideological nihilism. And he said, this is why the Soviet Union disappeared, because it stopped believing in its own founding myth. And there's a book that's called How the Soviet Union Disappeared. I'll post the link in the comments. And it's relatively short. And part of the argument there is like that the generation of Gorbachev and all these people, they were raised post-Stalin. And the people before them, okay, they were acting on lies, but they knew they were lies. And the people that came after didn't know the lies were lies. And they just looked at the West and they didn't realize that it was all propaganda. And then Gorbachev was maybe not as smart as a lot of people thought. You know, he was too good-hearted, too trusting. He gave it all away. You know, if you look at it from a power, I mean, on the one hand, it was this massive gesture, peacefully giving up the empire. If you look at it from a point of view of power, I mean, it was incredibly stupid and naive. And so on the question, are we watching the decline of the United States or the end of the empire? I mean, like, we should be careful of wishful thinking. Also, what David Graeber also wrote in here is like the end of the last time of the Bouillon regime. That was a series of catastrophes. And also what he says here is like, after the financial crisis, we all saw it's not working, right? And normally except what we had before, when we had like after the Great Depression and after World War II, there was, you know, limited resets in the system. For example, like the working class was in the West was included into the loot pie, you know, you could have your portion of it all. And there were limited changes for at least for some people. And post 2008, there was none. There was no rethinking at all. And we see the same thing now, post-corona. We see it now with the crypto crash, with what's happening in tech and all that. So if you look at this like from a point of view of extremely important and rare events, there's a guy who's called Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He came up with the notion of the black swan a few years ago. And what he says is the importance of unpredictable, extremely random events. And he said that the probability is like if you have like a normal distribution, right? You know, you have a fat tail event. Very unlikely, but highly influential. And the kind of punch it has increases when every system has a volatility. If you take the volatility and you stuff it under the carpet, you refuse any form of change. You know, the pressure just keeps building. And that can the resulting explosion can be anything. And yeah. So be careful of wishful thinking, and who knows, you know, what's going to happen.
Barbara, did you? I saw that your hand had been up. Would you like
Yeah,
to?
no, it's a bit far from what he was saying, so that's why I stopped. Just
No, that's okay.
that's
Please.
okay. So
Yeah.
for me, what was really interesting, but there are two things. The first thing is that it shows that violence has many faces. So, and history is not these arrows that we think that everything is always better. And the other thing is that the fact that the problem of the lack of human relationships. So violence becomes something without a face. And I think, and the idea of fear that is always there. And I think these two elements are really kind of, I don't know, they're kind of important, because the idea that without human relationships, we can be very, very, mean. And so we can and fear make us mean. So I think it's just and we are not well as human beings. So there is a problem of mental health, personal mental health, that is connected to the health of the society in general. So I think that's kind of a very big point. Sorry.
Ryan, I don't know if your hand had been up also earlier, but if it was and you'd like to speak, feel free.
Hi, thank you. No, my hand wasn't up. I'm listening though.
Oh, okay. Let's see, Steve. You're on mute.
Christian, did you also have your hand up, or is that from last time? Oh, okay. Just to respond or continue from what Barbara was saying, and from what I recall the conversation was last time, toward the end. Part of the next steps have to be restoring mutual aid. In these violent systems, there's a breakdown of mutual aid. There's in these systems of economics in which debt is abstracted from or decontextualized from the circumstances, again, it does not encourage mutual aid. It encourages a kind of individualism and self-preservation that is diametrically opposed to mutual aid. And so I'm wondering if we could talk about ways in which mutual aid could be fostered. This becomes especially true in light of what Peter was saying about the various crises that we face. It's not just a monetary and political economic crisis. It's also a climate crisis. It's also a health crisis. It's also and along with food, it's also and food and water crisis, right? So there's a number of I guess what could be termed a perfect storm for the breakdown of many systems. And the question is, how do we create community resilience? I think this is in line with some of David Graeber's work. Certainly his essay introducing a new edition of Mutual Aid by Kropotkin. It's certainly in line with Kropotkin and his critique of both capitalism and Marxism, right? Start building up small federalized system, well, not federalized, but a system of small communities and mutual aid, recontextualize human life. And so is that of interest to all of you? And is that a a possible avenue or direction for the conversation. Yes.
Nika?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Steve. I think that's what brain trust, David Graeber Institute brain trust is about. And also I want to say that I just went to the conference in Hamburg that was created by the Kurdish movement in Rojava. And it was, what are they trying to do now? They're trying to connect to the other movements around the world that is doing the same, like in India, in Zapatistas, of course, and some groups in Amazonia, in Brazil, who's fighting for Amazonian forest and so on. So they truly like internationalist movements, because the idea is like the mutual aid is not only the mutual aid with our neighbors, but these autonomous communities should be everywhere, and then they can become a power. And of course, it's a question of how to make it work. But it looks that's also in the same time what's happening out there. So, and also to pick up this conversation about the end of the petrodollar, that looks like it's may happen. The other side that is, you know, kind of against that American empire is not so good as well. So we have to kind of survive somewhere in between, or like take over some other space, or like in the old Jewish joke, they say like, you know, give me another planet. That's the old Jewish guys like flying. Soviet migrant is flying back to different countries. In one plane, he's saying like, "Oh, is it other planet exists? I don't know where to fly next." Yeah, definitely. That's what we all have to do day and night. Please join the Brain Trust projects. It will start hopefully in September.
Joseph.
I would like to understand a little more about what the Brain Trust project is going to do. Would you be willing to speak a little more about that, Nika?
Yes, with a lot of enthusiasm. So Brain Trust is actually set up by David on last year of his life on the ask of Extinction Rebellion, and we're going to have Extinction Rebellion demonstration this weekend, starting from tomorrow, Saturday and Sunday. And Extinction Rebellion, as many of you know, was a protest movement. And the idea was that if enough people will be engaged in protest and show civil disobedience, then the government will change the course. And it was demands of Extinction Rebellion to the government, and the attempt to force the government to acknowledge the climate change disaster that is going to happen. So David, of course, was very critical of some aspects of Extinction Rebellion, because it was a protest movement, and David was for direct action. And now, a couple of years later, we can see that he was right, because it doesn't matter how many people show civil disobedience, the government, of course, very well prepared for any protest movements. And if you want to play power games of government, they're always stronger. So they say, oh, you know, like, you want to threaten us. This is what we're going to do. But in any case, David, so we went to the 2019. The first uprising, it was really spectacular because there was a lot of people out there. They occupied bridges, so it was massive. And so David was engaged in trying to create a positive program. not what government can do, but what all humanity should do to make a positive change. So he collected lots of people. I think it was several meetings. Each of them had like maybe 50 people, also on Zoom and in his office in London School of Economics, anthropologists, engineers, economists, artists, writers. So the idea was we all come together and we propose for every human, what should we do in construction, what should we do in education, what should we do in banking, and so on and so forth to survive, basically. And David was very positive. So, okay, we're a bunch of smart people. We come, we think, and we come up with a solution because it's a crisis coming. So the brain trust in David Graeber Institute is a little bit different. So is have two major like cases that is based on. So one is climate change already happened, we cannot prevent it. And the second one is government is not going to help us. So it's like waste of time to actually even engage in conversations. And then, so what would we do after we knew all these two things? And the idea is to try to figure out what can we do right now and here, not in the future, not when we take over the government or whatever else, engage in negotiation, but right now, in what can we do, meaning like we as an urban poor, not as some billionaires who can go to New Zealand and dig the bunker, or like a bunch of hippies who is buying the land and moving, somewhere and creating some commune of wealthy people who is have means of learning, agriculture and so on. So yeah, and so we start from September, and we're starting from lectures. So it will be like online lectures that we were doing for 3 years with the conversations. And each lecture will be very practical. And so the idea is it will be people who can give an advice, so like not advice, but real description of what could be implemented right now, here and there. So we start with Alan Bauer, who was one of the first speakers in the Museum of Care 3 years ago. So he's a person that I met roughly the same time as David, because I Googled his manifesto that he was, as a professor of Bath University, he put online. This guy is behind of 80% of 3D printers that now exist, and he created a design for. He's an engineer, and he created a design of a 3D printer that printed itself. So it's not. It's actually was a very political project, because the idea in his manifesto was we don't need to take the means of production. We just distribute it to anybody who wants, to capitalists and to working class people. And so now, like, so when he started, his 3D printer cost quite a lot of money, like £1,000, and now I think it's like around £200. So every year it's getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, because the more and more parts of itself it can replace, and it's a different variety of this 3D printer. So they not only can produce things, they also can produce, I don't know, stuff like food, hopefully medication in the future, and so on. So the brain trust will follow the same routes that David's. So we'll go through each part of human society, like education, production of things, medical care, security, and so on and so forth. For now, we have 12. Bring the speakers and then try to create enough projects around that, like reading groups, art projects. We have a thinking about poster campaign, I don't know, whatever come to mind, and then just try to spread it around through these horizontal communities. And for example, a couple of days ago, with during presentation of the Lucas plan, it was a lot of talk about in the UK. There are hundreds of local communities that is sharing with each other a different way of living. Kind of they building the resilient mutual aid in parallel of the state, and that's what happens with Kurds, and that's what happens with Rojava and with Zapatistas. And I think this is going like many countries around the world. And the question is that when collapse will come, that it's obviously looks like will come, it's unavoidable, then some part of the earth will be more prepared than another. And then the lucky people will be there where it's possible to survive. And of course, all the right-wing discourse is basically trying to convince people that if you have your pension plan, or if you have enough weapon, or if you have this and that, then you will leave. But the obvious truth, this is like a bad plan. It's not about being like right or left. It's just a bad plan. You can't survive in the New Zealand bunker because your security will take you over, you know? So, or it's just either we're gonna have a collective way of confronting whatever is coming, or we will die in pain. I think it's simple as that. And yeah, there is no, we will just need to try to do what is good. And that's the plan.
All right, well, I see that it's 20 minutes past the hour, so I think this is probably a good place to pause. So thank you, everyone. So that means in 2 weeks, we'll meet again and we'll have the final session. Nika, is there something else you wanted to add?
Yeah, maybe you can just announce what we were talking before, so the people can send to you some proposals or to the mailing list, and then we invite speakers in the last session.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, what I'd like to do is I'm gonna try to, Nika has some people in mind that she would like to invite to our last session. If any of you have proposals about future reading groups, this is, you know, the Museum of Care, it is whatever we make it. So it's not like Nika and Mark and Michael and I are the Museum of Care. Everyone who's here is the Museum of Care. So we are what we are, who shows up is the Museum of Care. So it's, you know, an inherently collaborativist and anarchist kind of project where there are no ends, they're just the means, and we plow our way through the means. So if any of you have ideas about future things that you'd like to see the Museum of Care do, please reach out to any of us. Let me put my email here in the chat so that you have it. But I'm also, you know, easy. I think I'm easy to find. Because yeah, there are a lot of things that the David Graeber Institute and the Museum of Care are both working on, and so there are lots of opportunities. The debt group, for instance, we're trying to kind of turn this into something where there's a more permanent kind of presence from this, including materials that we can put together that are almost like study materials to go along with the book, and not just the debt book, but all of Graeber's work, and really all of the work that is out there that embraces the kind of decentralized, horizontally organized mutual aid focused, non-state direct actions. I mean, that's what the Museum of Care is all about. So, you know, we're always looking for opportunities to collaborate and to make as many connections as we can. So please do let me know if there are books that are particularly interesting to you that you think might be of interest to others who like reading this kind of material. And you know, we'll be happy to well, anyone here is welcome to create their own room on the Museum of Care. That's one of the things that's so wonderful about the Museum of Care, is that, you know, as long as it's not child pornography, or doesn't deliberately try to kill innocent people, I think we're, you know, pretty open to the idea of exploring ideas and concepts and alternate ways of reimagining the world, because, you know, we all know that other worlds are possible because people are always living those worlds mutually. So, okay, let me pause there. Thanks again. It's great seeing everyone. And I look forward to our last iteration of this reading group, and with the knowledge that there will be many more in the future. So thank you, everyone. See you next time.
Thank you.